Welcome to Anarchy, episode 2. Anarchy.
So cool that we can even do this, though. You know, like we live in a time in history where we can solidify visually and auditorily these conversations in time and space and then share them at incredible speeds across the entire planet. That's just legitimately cool as fuck.
I never, I was never big with video calling, but I do remember the few times I used Skype when I was younger before internet got to be fast, and it was just every other word said was glitched out, and it just, I mean, maybe that was just my experience because I'm from my town. Most of the town doesn't even have high-speed internet accessibility to this day. I mean, you could always get the, what do you call it, through your phone provider, you can get those hotspots, but it's not the same as.
Yeah. How you doing, Suzanna?
Doing good.
Yeah. You want to
Yeah.
introduce yourself? I guess you're the newest member of this menagerie.
I am. I'm looking forward to it. I think we all have different perspectives we can bring towards a common goal. So that's really what drew me in. On top of my own, I hate to say it's sort of selfish personal reasons, but that's because, I suffer from anxiety, ADHD, and stuff like that. So I really think that I can agree that this is something that needs to be addressed in our milieus. So
yeah, and I think it's necessary to point out that it's not selfishness, but self-interest. There's selfishness has a negative connotation, and self-interest. Everyone has self-interest. No, if anyone says otherwise, they're basically lying, or maybe they're Buddha, maybe they've transcended reality. I don't know, but
I know. Well, that's true. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe
I was just trying to say, like, rather than putting yourself down for your looking after yourself, it's selfishness just doesn't have the same ring to it as self-interest.
Absolutely agree.
I'm super into hacking that whole vibe you just described, that like moral hang up in culture that exists that says that acting in your own self-interest somehow negates altruism, sharing, kindness, all those other things that we associate with a little bit of a pleasant life, Yeah. So I'm super into hacking that because
that was my roommate was the one that actually kind of got me in the mode of thinking that way. I'm generally kind of old-fashioned with the usage of words. I don't really, I never really thought about the words. I kind of said, oh, well, here's the dictionary definition, but it kind of ignores some of those social implications. And so, I'm trying to, I hear these things sometimes, I hear people say something and like why it would be better to use a certain word rather than this word. And, I've grown to appreciate that.
Yeah, me too. I think language also plays a role depending on what society we're in. So having more positive words in, I would say, like our United States version of English would be nice because I don't think we possess those. I think it definitely all goes back in history and I won't get into that. That's just too much to cover.
Well, I was just gonna, that kind of made me think. Suzanna, you said that you, one of the fields that you studied in college was philosophy. What sort of philosophy did you particularly find interesting, or?
Well, I mean, it was more generalized because it is but not so much because a lot of philosophy ties into art history. Art history movements are usually born out of counterculture philosophy, and that's where I've studied most. And in a sense, you could say, I wouldn't say that it is this, but because of the school, the way it was, the free thought that we were allowed to have, it was very open. No idea was crazy, and we were able to really just dig into things and, read like, books from, original anarchists. We were able to really break down certain novels into what the symbolization was as far as how words were used. And so that's the type of philosophy I'm coming from, if that makes any sense at all.
Did you focus more on the on more Eastern, or I should say non-Western philosophy?
No, it was mostly Western because the arts in this day and age are very Eurocentric, but after everything that happened with George Floyd, we changed everything. We started trying to bring in non-Western art, non-Western philosophy, and I think it's still being worked on right now. That's currently what I'm doing with the class auditing and stuff like that, because unfortunately, because of when it happened, and of course, like, I'm not trying to speak negative of anybody, but I don't think the white community had prepared, or, they just waited way too long. So it's something that we all got to really work on and make sure. So that's where we're going now. Now, my knowledge of non-Western philosophy really comes from, like I said, I honored in the liberal arts. So I just focused a lot on what spoke to me. And that was, Native American history and culture and, and then also like civil rights movements and stuff like that. So.
Okay.
What brought you to anarchism?
Brought me to it? Well, I come from a long line of women that are very rebellious.
Rad.
So that's really what brought me to it. It was just my favorite writer was Bookchin, Murray Bookchin. And environmentalism brought me to it, and then mutual aid as well. So while I was in school, we did a lot of work for soup kitchens and food pantries. And I really enjoyed that. And it just made me feel like I was part of something. So instead of being an outsider all the time. So that really is what brought me to it, because I don't know, David Graeber, of course.
I'm actually not aware of who that is.
Well, he's one of my favorites. There's a lot of, there's some dislike for him in some of the communities, but I really like him. I like him a lot.
There's a lot of dislike in a lot of communities right now.
Yeah.
Just generally count on that to be happening if you exist.
That's true. It's It's just such a shame because he really writes from his heart.
Uh-huh.
And he's just got ideals that it just makes sense. And he talks about, if you're, essentially, I don't want to break it down to simple words, but essentially if you're a considerate person, you're an anarchist. If you care about someone, you're an anarchist, know. So
mutual aid, I feel, really is the root of anarchy at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
I think that's the bottom line for me is this about actualizing the power of the individual in the community for the benefit of the individual and the community without any assumed hierarchies. And I say assumed hierarchies because anarchism feels to me like a reaction to statism. Like you wouldn't call what anarchy is, you wouldn't call it anarchy prior to the injection of a state. It would be something different. Like, I hate the language around this as it exists right now, but there's a conversation of like primitive communism in places in indigenous America, right? And that's like a lens of like glomming on the Eurocentric, anthropocentric perspective of, a hierarchy of which cultures are better. That's why I don't like the primitive label.
I agree.
There's a belowness to it that. Go ahead, please.
Oh no! I absolutely agree. I actually was hoping that you would get on to this subject too, because it's like you said, it is a very Eurocentric view, and Eurocentralism is based in hierarchy. Period. I mean, that's just how the evolution of Western civilization has occurred, So, and I think looking at it that way, it doesn't really, it's just, to me, it just seems very, dare I say the word, it seems racist.
I mean, there's probably racism within it for sure. I don't even want to say probably, like racism can be identified in Eurocentric hierarchies.
Yeah.
And I think it can also be helpful. I feel like there's in our current political violent communication spiral that we're all in, there's a quick distinction between reactionary whataboutism versus like taking something as and considering it seriously and then holding it while also bringing in other aspects of information to expand the conversation and not to one up each other, but to expand our communication and learning and capacity for meeting the challenges we have in our society as people. And so if we can acknowledge that there's racism in Eurocentric hierarchical structures, is it beneficial to then also identify where those structures emerge outside of the Eurocentric reality, perspective, experience, whatever, not for the sake of minimizing one or the other or comparing them to, or to contrast even, but just to go like, where do the root patterns of hierarchy emerge in culture, especially including in Eurocentric culture and how that relates to colonialism? Because, I feel like understanding colonialism is important for understanding cycles of violence in our communities. And it only helps to expand that conversation beyond just what colonialism is as a historical outcome, but what it is as a governing process that people can, like, even if someone says they're an anarchist, they can still be governed by patterns of hierarchies they haven't even seen within themselves yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So the labels can help us navigate, but really it's the practical outcomes that we can really measure things by, right?
Exactly.
And that allows us to take, I think, those larger historical conversations and bring them home into ourselves. Like, where am I colonizing or not? And by colonizing, I just mean like letting my vibe take from somebody else. Yes. in a way that's not a consensual abundant feedback loop of consent and like choice and creativity, right?
Absolutely.
It's like, it's just taking, is a really oversimplistic aspect of like what I think colonization is. It's just, it's finding something you like, and the goal to take it is the outcome, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Absolutely. It's exactly, I think that you nailed it with that. Absolutely. And that's maybe why we need to start avoiding the word primitive, So maybe we should avoid that and just say, you're just a green anarchist,
I mean, I do, it's not really my place to say, because this is a large, wide conversation, but I do like the idea of primary.
Yeah.
Right? It's like a bit of a hack on primitive, because like prime numbers are powerful numbers. They're unique and interesting numbers. You can't make them go away. They're not primitive numbers, right?
Right.
They're prime numbers. So if we start thinking of it as like primary organizational, like it sets a centering of the conversation in a way that, at bare minimum, we don't have to even say we're talking about fact, because we can say we're talking about vision extracted from perceived fact, right?
Yes.
Like the goal isn't to like work backwards to a perceived past. It's to create based upon primary organizational modes that have worked for long periods of time for people, and figuring out how to bring that back with what we have now and synthesize, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's a lot of conversation around that, but I'm taking up a lot of time.
No, I think that's good. Like, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think it's being missed. And kind of feel like people aren't, so say you take a label such as green anarchist,
Mm-hmm.
and there's someone else with another label,
Mm-hmm.
which is, in my mind, this is like a way to separate ourselves, which I don't really like in the anarchist community at all.
Mm-hmm.
So say someone else is a anarcho-communist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's differences because it revolves around economics more than it does, other things. So there is differences, but I think that there is a misunderstanding where people think that, what green anarchists believe is to completely, basically rid the earth of like mankind, and it's totally not that.
What is green anarchism? I'm not even super familiar with it.
Well, it's really just an emphasis on the environment, and then it extends the autonomy to animals.
So it's anthropocentric.
In some ways, yeah. I mean,
I got that out of my mouth right.
I mean, if we're thinking of like those type of terms, absolutely, but it's just not to, we do recognize that throughout industrialization, it's caused a lot of problems, or we've created more extinctions. And, these are our systems that we rely on as human beings. And so therefore they are a part of us. So, that's that cycle that we're talking about of, the not taking from, but existing in a way that's harmonious. Mm-hmm. So that's really, in my opinion, and I may be wrong, but some other people interpret it differently, but that's how I interpret it.
That was like what I've gotten from green anarchy, and again, I don't know what my label is, so to speak, but I did read with green anarchy that it's taking, whereas all other systems before it have kind of kept nature and humanity separated, it's more like trying to put them back together and having humans exist within the ecosystem rather than outside of it where they just go in to extract resources.
Exactly. That's exactly the point of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So permaculture is a big part of this conversation, right?
Yeah, it really is. It should be. I'm sure it is. We're looking at ways of sustainability. So like instead of obviously like burning coal, which we already know is bad and stuff, we could go back to burning wood, things like that. But you take a tree, you replace a tree. So yeah, I would say permaculture. Absolutely.
That's good to hear, especially considering that what I consider to be the power of permaculture and its inevitable emergence in at least American culture. And I know that's a Eurocentric perspective, but I don't have a lot of experience going outside of my country that I live in. A ton. I've been out a couple times, but not a lot. I'm not world traveled, so I can only really speak in America, but it's blossoming as just a basic scientific idea of like, oh, this is how you get the land to express what it's going to express without my interference, and how I participate in that and feed it and work with it in ways that require just a lot of consideration that saves a ton of work that has a lot of outcome. It's happening in Florida, it's happening in California, it's happening in places across the United States where people are from their own power in different ways creating land that is being run from a permaculture perspective. That's kind of actually one of the visions I have in general for just anarchist organizing, is to identify those places and make them popular, basically. Right? If more people can see, and that's going to look different because the emergence of permaculture transcends political ideology, right? It's just, it works as a way to grow food and abundance from the land with what's already there. And so people are going to believe different things while they're expressing the skills legitimately. So in a climate of political violence, if that's emerging, if that physical pattern of people growing their own food in a sustainable way that can be shared and replicated easily with just a few shiftings of ideas and of directions of labor, keeping people not, like, making sure nobody starts killing each other while that's happening can be really good, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so at bare minimum, making sure that people can recognize the common benefit of permaculture across wildly different cultural, groups. And that's a big goal. That's a very difficult goal right now, especially considering, how deep tribalism goes to our organizing practices. Like we organize by affinity. That's going to happen, And that's what I appreciate about anarchy, is that for me, at bare minimum, it's making me question every perceived or every preconceived notion I would have around any group or individual that exists with a label or not, right?
Right.
And kind of taking it into like an intuitive level, right? Where it's like, where am I getting caught up in my assumption of what someone means with their words, and where are they doing that for me? And if that's happening, is it generating conflict? For me, anarchy is just always a return to, I have no idea who this person is, and their autonomy is going to tell me. And so I need to make space for them to communicate with me. Hopefully they'll do the same, make space for me to communicate with them on a practical level to create safety and abundance and community. Not just in chat rooms or podcasts, right?
Right.
And permaculture is it's a really potent bridge for that. It's really, really powerful.
absolutely agree with you on that. And absolutely, because it's also a form of mutual aid, so it definitely bridges that. It's like being able to grow in abundance and then, having that food available to give to someone else. And then, it's just everybody flourishes from it. And it takes away a lot of the competition, in society that we have. And that's kind of more or less the goal of, green anarchism. And, but also, it's not just limited to anarchy. It's going all over the world. It's a phenomenon that's thankfully happening for the rest of us. So,
Tyler, what did you say about something about competition the other day when we were doing the pre-call? So any system based on competition, something. It was really good. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, it was getting into people's ability, how the competitive world is intrinsically ableist because it's all about competition. It kind of puts us in a social Darwinist arena from the get-go, that if you can do something, then you perish. And so this is something I wanted to investigate more with green anarchy, because from what I've read, it seems a lot of people seem to think that green anarchy has the greatest affinity to erasing ableism by the nature of a communalistic lifestyle and kind of ridding us of this competition. So this is a pretty interesting topic to me, is kind of how competition has kind of gotten into every facet of our life, not just our favorite sports teams, but literally our lives itself, from grade school, trying to get the best grades you can get. You're competing with your classmates, to competing to get into colleges, to competing at your job to get promotions. And, rather than everyone bringing in their abilities and creativity on their own time, because not all people are going to express it at the same time. And it kind of, this brings me to, I don't know if you guys watched King of the Hill at all growing up.
Not a ton, but I know the show you're talking about. Yeah,
there was this one episode where Bobby decides to get into rose growing. Like he had this interest in his neighbor's rose bush, and so he chose to start growing it. But then his father, Hank, sees this as a sign of weakness, but then he learns to make it manly by turning it into a competition and getting him into this competition for growing the best roses, trimming them the right way. And, and it just kind of showed throughout the episode, it goes from Bobby having this passion to completely losing interest in what his father had to do, while he was secretly growing his own garden of roses inside of his closet. So it was just kind of an interesting episode for me. But
it's that ding dang gender binary, man.
But I mean, in general, it just competition is just so pervasive in our society that some people, they may not really show much potential through their life, and then like one day they just have this brilliant idea or brilliant work, and it could help out society greatly. But when we have this this competitive lifestyle where we discredit anyone who can't compete, well, then we're losing out in the end. So.
Yeah, competition is, but I feel like that's where making space for things helps, right? Like sometimes I like to be competitive when it's, that's what, that's what games are. That's what sports are.
And I don't think competition is necessarily bad. It's just a matter of we have built our culture around competitiveness rather than working together and our community. And that's my biggest thing. Is I think there should be some overlap, if we consider it kind of like an abstract Venn diagram, your competitive nature and your lifestyle, there should be overlap, but it shouldn't be like a complete overlap. It shouldn't be a perfect circle.
Talk about balance, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's competition kind of brings out some good in everyone, but when you focus too much on it, it's just like now we're at this point where we call people who are billionaires successful when someone is enjoying their life as, with an income of $30,000 a year. They may not be rich, but their life is rich. Why are they not considered successful? But this guy who has billions of dollars, who's causing like ecological decay, why is he considered successful?
Yeah, seems like a pretty arbitrary metric.
Yeah, exactly. It gives us a number to work off of. But so that's hopefully that is a segue to you, Suzanna, since you're more tuned in with Green Anarchy. Maybe your perspective on how the system might better accommodate people who are less competitive, or maybe what we call disabled. You told me that you had that you wanted to change the language altogether so that we didn't think in terms of ability and whatnot, but just kind of seeing everyone as unique.
Absolutely. That's kind of where, we are inspired by, the way indigenous cultures are, such as the Aboriginals in Australia. Here too, there is that you don't look at a person based on ability or their materials that they own. They're not judged by that. They are just a member of the community, and they are unique. And that's kind of what, people who appreciate the diversity that comes from nature and, the gifts that are given to us, not only by Mother Nature herself, but if you really want to go into a spiritual part, there's a spiritual part to it, but it's still a gift. It's still a gift just to have someone who can give you a whole different perspective on everything. So that may be from thinking differently just because your brain is different. It could be from, just, a disability of some sort. You're still an important member of the community. It doesn't change, doesn't force you to compete because the community itself is providing for that person. There's an example that I had read this beautiful passage when I was studying in school, and it was that a lot of indigenous cultures, if they don't have something, say like a blanket, that person who is not able to, let's say, go and obtain materials to make a blanket, one will be provided for that person. And that's why you see a lot of cultures that, take care of their elderly. They live based off of compassion. So when green anarchy comes into it, like Eugene just talked about the permaculture situation, that abundance would be given to you. It wouldn't be something you would have to work for. It's shared with the community. It's not something you have to work for in particular, if that makes any sense at all.
I think there's a lot of ways to interpret that from a lot of different perspectives. And it's a perspective that I personally, I emotionally feel in alignment with it. Personally, I get it, but I don't want to assume that you and I or anybody else exactly has the same understanding of that as far as how it meets practical application. And that's where I want to, and I think I'm always going to end up coming to this place. How do we make this practical right now in our communities of what we're dealing with? Right. And, that's a big question, because if the more we converse across different communities, the more that answer is going to be completely different.
Absolutely.
And equally correct at the same time, even if it seems substantially incorrect from one person's perspective based on where they are, right? But if we know that permaculture works, if there's literal evidence of it emerging in our environment on I just want to give another shout out. Is it okay if I give a shout out to another podcast here?
Yeah.
You guys mind? I just want to give a shout out to the Dangerous Gentleman podcast. No, it's called The Cult of Dangerous Gentlemen. And it is a very unsanitary podcast. Like if they say a lot of just really horrible things, just terrible things. I would actually suggest anybody avoid listening to be perfectly honest. Personally, ableist language physically hurts me, right? Because of my history with the words of stupid, retard, et cetera, how that's physically impacted me in my environment and my community. So it's like physical pain for me to hear it. Different people have that same, I wager, similar pain sensation around hearing certain language for super valid reasons. Folks over there largely don't care. And I'm not saying that's okay. And however, I've been wading through my own pain process to talk to them and found that at the center of it is a commonality that I'm trying to reverse engineer into the language, hopefully. And the core of what attracts me to that podcast is one of the people who puts it together is building a permaculture farm in Florida right now. And they're documenting it and they want it and they're sharing it. They're literally showing how permaculture generates so much that you in many times just end up having to give away food to your neighbors all the time. And he's going into the social relationships in community as it pertains to sharing permaculture with other people on their land, and how that blends and merges is, for all intents and purposes, green anarchism and is permaculture. However, anyone I would wager who's been, calibrated to one side or the other of the political spectrum right now in America is going to be hyper keyed around a number of different linguistic, physical, and social cues that are going to tell them, danger, this is my enemy, right? And I respect that. And I kind of already knew that like by even bringing them up, I was going to make myself vulnerable to like, oh, this person is associated with this person, so therefore we're going to, dox them or something. I don't know. But that's okay. If I need to get doxed, dox me. I don't have nothing to lose. I got my dragon pants on, so I can get drug.
I've been doxed for being who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point is that the permaculture, the evidence for the efficacy of permaculture exists literally across the political spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. And the conversations that I'm listening to happen in these really different non-leftist communities that are happening they're like the exact same conversations the anarchists are having. They're just metabolized completely different with a completely different set of priorities and perspectives. But the commonality is enough that I think it just really shows how anarchism isn't like a political party at all. It's a lifestyle. It's a life perspective and approach. It's a political position in oneself, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're talking about permaculture, and this is what I learned by kind of watching these other cultures that are not, that I would consider leftist at all, but they are becoming leftist. That's what's wild.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's some, I mean, just to springboard off that, I don't mean to interrupt you here, but...
No, please, I ramble.
No, it's a good thing to talk about that now because we can now address eco-fascism.
Right.
So, yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, those are people definitely outside of the leftist sphere, and I feel like it's been co-opted in a sense from us because, I think from around 1987 to 2000, Janet, if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, Janet Biel, she worked very closely with Murray Bookchin, and she co-authored, I believe, a book or maybe even an article with Peter. I can never pronounce the names properly.
Okay.
Staudenmeier or something. And it was called Eco-Fascism: Lessons from the German Experience. So this particular, because what had happened through that, it was not good with the eco-fascists. So, and I think a lot of the ableist ideals came from that. And it's been addressed, so I think maybe that's something that we need to watch out for, not just in the green community, but also anarchists all over. When I was growing up, it's not really an example of permaculture, but we always had an urban farm. And, we weren't able to give it away to like an entire country or anything, but we did to our neighbors, every summer, because here in the Rockies, it's hard to grow things. So you can only grow mostly in the summer. So we would have extra cucumbers, extra tomatoes. It was just in abundance. Mm-hmm. And we would just give it away. So I really think it depends on your attitude towards like your economical like point of, or not economical, but economical, when it has something to do with like how you feel about, being paid for what you're doing. And I think that needs to be removed. So you can't expect a return of income from this because it's not yours to begin with. It came from nature. It's not yours anyway. It's everybody's. So,
and that's a really
attitude.
Big shift. That is a huge shift. It's really difficult. Mm-hmm. Really difficult because it's so entrenched, It
is, and that's kind of what our goal is as anarchists, is to hopefully, if we're going to talk about mutual aid being the core, that is mutual aid. Giving away to others. you're already providing for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so why would you hoard those resources? And that's what we need to do. We need to change the social attitude.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't, I don't think legislation is the answer for sure. You know,
Yeah.
you can't legislate this without creating a counterforce that will end up becoming conflict. And then the point gets lost that, because people will resist something just because they're told they're supposed to by the state, which, I mean, I'm not going to judge that. And I can certainly relate at times. But the conversation of statism and anarchism they're both conversations of power. It's just power, right? So if people are trying to generate power for themselves at the expense of the community, I mean, one of the greatest examples of that, I feel like, at least in America, is the farmers throwing away surplus food to meet pricing goals, right? Or any business that throws away food. The overproduction aspect of our current paradigm is out of control. You know, I feel like that's like we produce so much more than we have to, and see, it's like this conversation when I talk to a lot of different folks, there's a lot of assumptions around, like Suzanne, a lot of the things that you said, I feel like I would just nod my head and be like, yep. But I'm also doing the labor of trying to be like, how else might somebody perceive that who's new to the conversation, right? Like the shift that you describe between just, it's letting go of ownership, right? Of anything, which is not a binary conversation. It's not a like absolute control versus I have no control over my life. You know what I mean? Like that's not what that means. It's just
not at all.
And so it's complicated, and people will hit it from that perspective if they're new to it, right? So in order to if we're talking about permaculture and we're talking about abundance being given away, I just want to point out as an observational fact that I'm watching people do that. And this is not to negate anything. It's just to add information. I'm watching people in real time build this thing within the capitalist model. And so to say, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all three of us are anti-capitalists, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So if I say, capitalism doesn't work because, and I present my theories, and then someone says, well, look, I'm using capitalism to generate this permaculture farm that's just like giving away food and generating the income to not only maintain, but grow other things that I want to build that will benefit the community on other dimensions simultaneously, building a whole level of community through capitalism. It's working, right? How do you bring up what we're talking about to somebody who's just like, how can you tell me what I'm doing is wrong? All I'm doing is successfully paying my bills, saving up a ton of money, and giving away a bunch of excess. Like, how do you counter that? To say that capitalism doesn't work. I
mean, that what they are doing sounds, I mean, this abstract person you just created.
No, it's a real person. I'm talking about.
Oh, you're talking about an actual person?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, regardless, I mean, to be honest, it sounds like they're explaining more of market socialism, which is different. Like, it does rely on market, it does have an exchange of goods for other goods or money, but but if they are the worker owning the means of production and they are not using it as, using their capital simply to profit, then I don't know if I would call it capitalism. I would say that it would be a free market where it works within the framework of capitalism simply because of the exchange of goods. But I mean, I just wanted to jump in there and say that, because it doesn't sound like capitalism there. It sounds like they have a goal in mind and realize, well, if we're under capitalism, we need to work within the confines of it. Like, doesn't mean that, I mean, to me, it sounds like if they could live without having to worry about paying a bank their mortgage or paying property taxes, and could just stay on this plot of land doing what they need to do, it kind of, like, what would be the difference? It's just that they don't need to generate money to afford this business. They can just do it and do it for the good of the people.
Word.
So I think it's, the transition from a money society to a moneyless society is, that definitely gets, raises some hair on people's backs. So,
yeah.
Well, it's,
capitalism is an addiction. In my opinion, people are very addicted to it because, we're seeing that in practice it supposedly worked. But this is where Bookchin talks about scarcity. So, but someone that's doing something like that, I agree with Tyler. That's more socialism than it is like capitalism, in my opinion. The only thing that I find difficult, and it's because of the person I am and the type of, things I believe and the way I live, I just don't see any sort of profit necessary. And, that's just my thing. Like, I don't see any necessity in profit if you have abundance. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like, it's a paradox to me.
Well, what if you wanted your $15 million mansion with 100 empty rooms? What about those people?
Exactly.
I'm joking, but I mean, I did come across this this yesterday. Like, people said, that their argument for why people don't deserve to have houses when we have an overabundance of houses, they're saying, well, what about those people that want to make money and have a better life? Should they have to live like dirt like everyone? It's like, no, if everyone's thriving, it just means you can't have your $15 or $15 million mansion. But that doesn't mean your quality of life has to be absolute shit. Sorry for the language, but it was something I heard yesterday, and I said, having a $15 million mansion is not the same as, or it's not the opposite of socialism. It's just, it is, but I lost my train of thought there. I was getting a little too passionate, but
Word.
Well, and how could you even make that comparison? Do you think others live like dirt?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, is either you're on this binary, either you have the most flamboyant, luxurious lifestyle, or you're living like plebes. It's definitely a mind-boggling thing that, and what I said to them was, well, look, if you're, if you can have this lifestyle without exploiting other people in the process, then sure, I'm fine with that. I personally wouldn't want it, but if you're somehow able to do it without exploiting people, then go for it. But I highly doubt you're going to find a way to live such a luxurious life without any sort of exploitation. You know, it's
I feel like this is where the conversation gets real muddy, and people can come at this from a lot of different ways in terms of what deserving means, what quality means, what need and desire and access and worth and all those things mean. And those are complex conversations, and they will happen, but it's very, for me, it's like slogging through mud, and I just want to get to the root of it, right? As a radical. And for me, the root of this massive conversation really comes down to rent and the social, biological, and temporal impacts of the existence of the idea and practice of rent. Like everything comes down to that. I think that there's not a single political conversation you could have that doesn't eventually connect to the state, which doesn't boil down to control of land through threat of physical violence, to the degree which value can be extracted from the individuals identified by the state, and recontextualized to support that whole process and metabolize and keep that metabolism going. Right? So if you think about the most, this is a really weird way to frame it. This is where anarchists get a bad name. I hope I don't give anarchists a bad name. But if you were like, how can I fuck this whole system up as easily as possible? How can I do the most damage with like the least amount of physical actual harm and impact? It would be to sabotage the housing market. Because that is the most consistent lurching form of income generation that nobody can escape from. Nobody. The only way you can escape from it is by upgrading your placement into the land ownership position, to which you're not changing anything. You're just individually changing your placement. Somebody else is underneath that lurching slog. And the thing is it's arbitrary. There's this arbitrary 30-day threat of violence that puts a push that isn't necessary for people to be productive or creative or kind or loving or supportive in generating abundance with each other. Rent is not necessary. It is beneficial, right? Like it's beneficial, like I would derive benefit if I, somehow managed to get my neighbors' houses and have power over that process. So now I had ownership of their houses. That's beneficial to me. So there's benefit there, right?
Yeah.
But
the perspective.
From that perspective, right? And that's the thing is like, if we're talking about neurodiversity, which we are in this podcast, right? That's one of our themes that's kind of core. Our brains shape our personalities. They shape our perspectives. They shape everything about us. And we shape our brains simultaneously. But both of those things are hard to change. And they can be tricky. And people can be in different parts of that in their development of themselves. And they have abilities to do that or not. So it would be ableist to say, in my perspective, that someone who doesn't have the ability to take themselves out of their own perspective and legitimately consider another person's perspective, it would be ableist to say that that person is less of a person, less valuable or less capable of having this conversation than someone who is.
Yeah.
Because they can't. And so that what that means is we have to be prepared to have these conversations with people that may be legitimate sociopaths, which means we have to stop demonizing sociopaths because they exist. Their neurology is a unique form of human neurology. And we have a system that rewards that ability to sidestep empathy for personal benefit in rent more than any other places. Cops and prison guards. I think that's the only other place you could really get that level of, immediate, I want power over others. That generates income, right? It's going to be landlords, cops. That's
politicians.
Politicians, even that's still not as juicy, man. And you don't have to be that capable of incredibly complex social engagement to be a landlord or a cop. You just need the right pieces of paper and the right decision-making processes and the right access to the outcomes of those decision-making processes. Someone's character, quote unquote, that's why I think, judging the meritocracy and the idea of a person having character merit doesn't work for transcending the concept of ownership, because it's wild, because that is identity politics. And yet people that are like, no, you have to be a good person. But identity politics, no, the fact that you have an identity and there's power attached to that, no, that's magic. And so I'm not quite sure. Where was I? Fuck, I lost it.
Well, you started off with housing being the...
so that's the root, right? So, and the thing is that people, regardless of how true that is or not, anybody having the conversation of anarchy or statism who's looking at the structures is going to perceive that conversation of rent being the root in different ways that are probably going to be pretty emotional, right? Because people's lives are on the line. This is what makes people homeless. Right?
So one thing I would like to add there was the 2008 it was 2008, right? The big housing crisis, the housing bubble burst. Maybe I'm wrong with the year, but
I think you're correct.
Yeah, but they did that to themselves. So before you were saying, as an anarchist, how can you stick it to the man the most? And you said, attacking the housing infrastructure. I mean, if taken literally, I'm guessing, I could always argue that the housing market is its biggest enemy. Every so often it creates its own bubble, crashes, but the issue is then you have the Federal Reserve, the banks, they all come in and bail out the housing market, and then all those people who caused the housing crisis, they kind of come back and just suck back all the resources again. They're like, oh, well, housing is cheap, and I just got a nice, bailout here. I'm going to use that money to buy up all these cheap houses now and do the same thing over again. So, so I just question whether it's housing that's the deeper issue here, because it's, I feel like the feedback loop is so ingrained in the whole network that every sector kind of feeds back into the other sectors. Property is a big thing, like home ownership. If everyone was able to own the land that they occupied, then, and not have to worry about being evicted while they choose to occupy that space,
right?
Then I think there could be a lot of good. Takes off a lot of people's anxiety. They don't necessarily need to go to a 9-to-5 job every day. They can do stuff at their own house, work on their artwork. They can code. They can, I don't know. They could do a lot of great things from the comfort of their own home without having to worry about being evicted.
Yeah, that pressure. I feel like that is, that's the thing. When I say rent is the root, what I'm not saying is that it's a prioritization in terms of what is like a better place or not to focus, right? Because as you pointed out, that housing market, that push, that trauma push, that constant stress and anxiety is that threat, that 30-day violent threat of eviction.
Oh yeah.
That pressure that it has it's also this is something to consider. That creates trauma.
Yeah.
And like, no matter what any person thinks or moralizes about trauma, it's going to cause human behavior to react in ways that are unpredictable. And in their unpredictability, they can actually be quite predictable. For instance, when in Oakland, I think it was 2017, 16 or 17, maybe, I don't remember what year it was. It was one year around that time where two giant apartment developments were burned down. Complete giant. It was huge. I don't think they found out who did it. And one of them, it was one place that got burned down twice. They were building this giant, super housing, Whole Foods in the middle of a neighborhood in Oakland that was being just severely gentrified, pushing all these people out. Shit got burned down one night. They built it again. Shit got burned down another night. That's trauma. I'm not interested in moralizing that.
Yeah.
Because when you take that individual anxiety hit of that 30-day threat of violence and you multiply it by millions of people, something's gonna give, and it's not gonna be fun. There's too much trauma behind it. People, like, when someone's deep in trauma, they're not like, trauma causes actual cognitive damage to our ability to perceive reality. Like, I'm not asking anybody to sympathize with any of these recent shooters, but just like consider the amount of trauma within their experience that got them to where they were recently, where they had to go gun down a bunch of people in a fucking supermarket or something, or like, I'm not trying to say therefore we need to open our hearts to them or anything. What I'm saying is that trauma creates conflict and violence.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's exactly. we should always hold those people accountable, but if you're not willing to address the root cause, it's just going to keep happening.
Exactly.
And we're just going to keep putting Band-Aids on the wound, but never actually heal the wound in the first place. So it just keeps reopening. And I get what you mean there. It's just individualizing the issue, and that's another point I wanted to make with current society, is how individualistic everything is. And I don't want to, I really like to say that the big difference between individuality, which is one's own individual expression, and individualism that places all responsibility on the individual and completely alienates them from the system that they belong to.
Right.
And that, this individualism comes up, homelessness is the biggest one for me, is that I see as people say, oh, well, they choose not to work, or they choose to do the drugs that they choose. It's like, a healthy person is not going to just pick up a needle and inject themselves with heroin. Like, there's definitely some underlying issue before that point. There's a lot of trauma. Everyone knows heroin is destructive, but when you see your life as absolute shit, picking up a needle doesn't seem like the worst thing you could do. And that's something I just can't get over, is how insensitive people are to these, individualizing these traumas that are created by a system.
So I agree. I think that distinction is really important. Susanna, did you want to say anything, though? Because I don't want to take up any more space.
Yeah, she's been kind of...
no, it's okay. I wanted to hear your perspectives, because for me, the perspective is coming, I'll admit, an anti-civilization perspective on my part. It's purely theoretical. It hasn't it's happened historically, but I think, that's part of the green anarchist feeling, is that once, civilization kind of breaks itself down, which capitalism has kind of proven itself to implode. So my perspective is that, yes, it's the housing markets, it's the banks, it's everything. Yeah. It's everything that ties into Western civilization itself. So for me, it's like, once we're at post-civ, we don't have those things anymore. So again, it would be a communal post-civilization society. So that's just kind of my thought, and it's very abstract, and it doesn't really solve our issues at the moment. But, all I can say is that I agree with Tyler that the housing, sector is its own worst enemy.
It's the truth.
It is. And since 2008, we've had, when we had the housing crisis, more people are, and then you add the pandemic on top of it, more people are homeless than they are owning homes. Mm-hmm. And so if we're going to go towards the, anarcho-capitalist, sorry, it's hard for me. I struggle just to say that, those two together.
I just hear an oxymoron.
I do. I struggle. It's like, okay, well, you're not making any money by people being homeless, pal. So, and that's really rude. Really rude. Really rude.
That's a good point, though. I mean, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe I've interpreted the information I've read incorrectly, but it's technically cheaper just to give everybody houses at the end, given the expenses that it costs to deal with homelessness, right? So, but that becomes, again, a conversation of statism and anarchism, because then the conversation becomes, well, who's responsible for those costs, right? So a state says, well, this is the cost based on the budget, based on nonprofit organizations and state structures that are meant to create programs to incentivize people to get access to housing through things like Section 8, government programs, and there's tons of programs. And that's kind of part of what I do with my work, but I avoid it, to be clear. It keeps interjecting into my life because of what I do for a living. And, the program, so that conversation of, well, who carries that cost? My answer personally is like, well, we all do eventually, in some way or another. And the degree to which you're insulated from that cost is the degree that your own personal cost emerges to maintain that insulation. So if you're a capitalist realist and you're just, everything's capitalism to you, that's where your profit margin is hit by homelessness, because you have to now insulate. You have to put costs into security, costs into entertainment to distract yourself. And then you have to be able to pay all the people that are into you being insulated from what's going on around them. So that is where the cost is generated. And that's where it will become, like, anarcho-capitalism will become feudalism. Because if you're governing that process on a strictly hierarchical model with someone at the top, their power is always going to be at the whimsy of their own subconscious, right? Mm-hmm. And like, there's not a lot of biological incentive to lean into suffering.
Right.
So if one has access to the ability to push suffering away, it just makes sense that they're going to do it. That's what addiction is, right? That's the needle in the arm, is the fucking property boundary in the massive entertainment system, right? So.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. And I haven't not tried to see it from their perspective. Of course, I have to live in their world.
Because they've shoved it down everybody's throat.
Right, like for hundreds of years. Yeah. And because it's like capitalism, I mean, yeah, everybody wants to consider it as something that, bloomed out of the Industrial Revolution. I would argue that that's where it started. Not like capitalism has been around forever, because if it's essentially the heir to imperialism. And so the thing with trying to see their point of view, I immediately think about those whose autonomy and sovereignty has just completely, been violated. And I can't get on board. And, I try, but it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it doesn't lift anybody out of poverty when, let's say where I'm about 15 miles away from people who were forced on a reserve that have to wait 3 months to get water. So that, it's to me, it's like we're supposed to be the richest, country in the world with all of our capitalism, but not 15 miles away from me, there's people who don't have access to drinking water while I'm turning on a faucet, and I'm not having to worry, is this going to cause birth defects, and stuff like that. So for me, I have to think of it on a human level, and it's not compatible at all.
So this actually makes me I want to bring this back to what you said earlier, Eugene, about calling people out for not being able to step outside of their perspective. You said, about how it's ableist to call out someone who's a sociopath, who's...
I didn't say, first of all, I didn't say anything about calling anybody out. I said, how do we consider a non-ableist perspective, given that someone might enter into community with a neurological inability to empathize with other people or see other people's perspective.
Okay, so I misunderstood, but I mean, still, it was an interesting point, because I wanted to make the distinction between the people who, I don't know what the statistics are on how many people in society are actually sociopaths, but then there's some people who are in this privileged position where they don't want to, it seems like they can't get out of their mindset because they benefit too much with being in their mindset. And so this is something I want, I thought was a little bit complicated with what you were saying is, how do we reason with someone who is trying their hardest not to empathize for people? And I mean actively trying to avoid empathizing.
I don't think reasoning is where it's at, personally, because empathy isn't reasonable. Emotions are messy. They're both chaotic and ordered. Our thoughts order themselves from our emotional experience, and our individuality is somewhere in there. And that's cool as fuck. And I'm not gonna make any claims on what individuality is, because I can't figure it out. It's the more I see in myself and in others, it's a constant, unending journey of learning and of human consciousness emerging. But I do know that my neurology in my body is where my immediate egoic perception emerges from and is shaped from. And it lies to me on purpose all the time, because that's what it's supposed to do. Because it doesn't matter how dense the dirt is below me. My body doesn't need to take that into consideration, because that's not part of my environmental navigation. If I was a mole, that would be different. If I was an insect, that would be different, right? I don't need to really be super in tune with the wind if I don't want to. I do want to, but I don't have to. But a bird does. Just to go get across all the territory, it's got to navigate whole complex wind systems, and so its nervous system is keen to tiny changes in that and whatnot. And it's the same thing for individuals. We find commonality in our social fabric, which is in and of itself, it's as massive a conversation as individuality is a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where someone gave me a term recently. I like coming up with new shit. This person came up with some new shit. They call it vibrational tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been chomping on it for a while, and it's irritating me in the way where I'm like, it's irritating me because it's new information and I'm having to change my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I like it because I like that it makes me uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable because it shows where I'm rigid in my need to find commonality and understanding based on my own perceptions rather than a subtler set of informational processes that do exist underneath my ego that extend in ways where I can find commonality and trust in places like having this conversation with you guys. We didn't interview each other. We didn't have any applications we filled out. And this happened rather fast because we just trusted it. Like there's enough language going on enough levels between the three of us across, pretty extreme distances. Mm-hmm. Yet we're trusting to be vulnerable and blather in front of public people with each other. And that's cool. And I think there's something to that. This is why doing like connecting visually with each other in real time, it's like kind of what COVID has inadvertently caused to happen, where all of a sudden people are doing more media generation, like documenting each other's thoughts. And it's like, it's cool. It's kind of creating a living library, but it doesn't benefit as much if there's not cross-pollination and interconnection. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's kind of my biggest selfish desire is I derive great pleasure from connecting people and the most unexpected connections usually, and just seeing how people synthesize and create from very different places, which creates, symbiogenesis, where two sets become so integrated that they become a third set, that the two can't really, like our mitochondria are they're endosymbiotic, and they're a product of symbiogenesis. Our mitochondria, when it evolved, was different organisms that started working together, and then they became our like engines for our bodies. It's fucking cool as shit. We got these little alien buddies in our genes.
I believe
our little wormy guys, our wormy boys in our genes, making power for us. And so that same methodology, that that conscious agency that is my mitochondria, that is a symbiogenetic agent, is a part of a symbiogenetic process that is my body, which is a result, is my ego, is the symbiogenetic result of my body and all the things inside of it. And then, so when we take the idea of symbiogenesis outside of the individual and we start factoring in like relationship and how we're always in relationship, always, period. Even if we're not aware of each other, we're aspirating the same air. We're exchanging material biologically, laterally. Like do you guys know about like lateral gene transmission? You ever heard of that? Where like you can get, like viruses can spread people's genes laterally. Mm-hmm. So you can end up with someone else's genetic code in your body by accident. I never met them, and that influences aspects of your genetics in ways that are. I think this has to do with like chimerism, and like when people will they'll develop a fetus after getting lateral transmission. That fetus will have the DNA of like different people that weren't part of the actual biological sexual reproduction. It's a wild conversation, but the point is that we're always generating newness by existing internally and externally. And that's part of permaculture, right? Just figuring out where we all fit together and how our autonomy is a crucial component of that. Mm-hmm. And it's gonna be a lot easier to do that if we're not threatening people every 30 days with violence. Like that's the thing. It's like any landlord, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're like a robot organization, corporation, or like the cutest granny in the world. Like at the end of the day, if your tenants don't pay up, you're calling the cops or beginning a harassment campaign or something, right? And if you want to talk about empathy and shifting perspective, then think the place of like solidarity that can emerge here is that granny, if we really want to be like, fuck all landlords, we should not consider their existence. That's an option. Some people are going to do that. Or we could go, well, that granny's being pressed by the bank. That granny's being pressed by the state. That granny's being pressed by X, Y, and Z. So now we need to stand with the granny and be like, Granny, you're not taking our rent anymore. We're not doing this anymore. But we're not going to throw you under the bus. And we're with you in resisting the press that you're getting. So that's where you can kind of, if you're going to focus on neutralizing that aspect of society, the rental process, the housing market, essentially, or at least the root of what it is now, that will boot up the solidarity. And it won't boot up all the way through the landlord class, because that has to hit like Nancy Pelosi is a landlord, right? So like the state is going to fight anything like this like a motherfucker. And so, but anyways, that's the most accessible like route, is if you find the point of common accessible, that's where it's got to be. It's got to be accessible solidarity in resisting landlords. The most immediate practical application of shifting that energy is going to be in the independent landlords, which is going to look real different across a lot of different geographic locations, at least in a lot of different places. But then it hits the corporations, right? Like, and that would be the next overcome, so to speak. But on a grassroots practical level, there's, we kind of, I don't know, like if you have space, share it. That's all I've found. Like if you have access to space right now, share it with someone who doesn't have it. That's like the most, I have like a tiny little room in a house that's not mine that I live in, and it's very small. But even when I've had something not bigger than that, I've known people that didn't have a place to live that I'm like, come be in the safe box at least, so you're not getting wet or cold or harassed or anything. And there's never been, at least in the environment I grew up, a lack of people that needed that. So anytime I've ever had access, that's just always what I've done. It's actually got me in a lot of trouble. People don't like it. When you do that, people get real mad when you share your space.
Well, yeah, they do. Absolutely. That's why there's something in the green community, and I don't know, you probably heard this as an anarchist. It's called an intentional communities, or what they are is essentially a commune. So if we cannot access a landlord, let's say the landlord is like, yeah, that still affects my bottom line, period, because they're not profiting. And they may not get on board. This is where like we have the problem with the capitalist mindset, is it's always the individual's bottom line, no matter what. Like what kind of situation, if I have to put myself in their shoes, what kind of situation is this going to put me in financially? So we have to like pretty much eliminate that completely by building communities that not so much own the land, but have land where everybody is intentionally living there, just like you described, kind of like, I guess you could call it squatting, but not necessarily. And those are the ways that mutual aid works to kind of eliminate that system altogether, so, and they don't like it. The statists don't like it. The capitalists don't like it. And they make fun of it. They mock it, but
they'll like literally attack you if you do it too. I remember I let this one person I met, and I totally trusted him, and I continue to trust him to this day, sleep in my car. He's this homeless dude in my community. I let him sleep in my car one night because he didn't have a place to go, and I didn't have a room to offer him. And the parking attendant in the area called the cops, and like the cops like fucking destroyed the inside of my car searching through it and took him to jail. And I woke up, and what's ironic is I woke up in the morning and my car was trashed and he was gone. And everybody around me was like, see, told you should let that homeless person stay in your car. And I was like, I have no evidence. What are you talking about? Like, it seems like a pretty quick jump. Like I mean, I spent time with this person. Doesn't match up. And people were getting mad. I lost friends over this shit. One person was just like, you're too irresponsible. I don't want to be your friend. I was like, fair enough. And, it turns out he was just minding his own damn business in my car when the cops showed up because some parking attendant saw him sleeping in there. And so they ruined my car, took him to jail. He didn't do a damn thing. The cops did. The cops fucked up every single thing about what was going on. Mm-hmm. I mean, they didn't just fuck up his night and like neutral. Well, I mean, he technically got a place to stay in jail, I guess, but that's a really different environment. Like,
it's like the cops and the person who called the cops.
Exactly. It's the cops agents, which are the,
Yeah.
And that's, I could pull a lot of stories out of my life that just kind of echo the same sentiment. And I'll still do it. I'll do it again and again and again, because it is not that hard. It's just scary because it's scary in the way that I think anarchism is scary for some people. Just the idea of I need to know what I'm supposed to do at any given moment based on what interests me. I need that protection of this happens. This is the reaction. I'm safe. This is the thing, right? And they'll build up whatever they need to believe around that to have access to that. And it's scary stepping away from that, And so I can't get mad at people that are like really entrenched in that pleasure or pain response around the idea of, a lack of a violently affixed state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Like, this is why we do need to shift that focus into more communal, like, places. So, like, be more sustainable together and kind of, excuse my language here, but, fuck the system in such a way that they just can't control what we're doing, how we're living. So I mean that's just how I see it, is the intentional communities or those intentional communes or start, so
those. And I like the idea of cooperative housing.
Yep, that's a huge one.
A whole group of people owning the house, and if someone wants to move out, then they can sell their share to someone else. I mean, assuming we're still in the capitalist section, you need to come out with something so that you can move on to your next point in life. But yeah, having housing co-ops at, as long as you bought into the house and initially, then you can't be evicted because you own the house. Like I mean, again, this is just looking at it from a capitalist perspective on a more anarchist, socialist viewpoint. But yeah, I mean, another thing that I it kind of brought to my mind are like HOAs, and I don't know if you've probably heard the term NIMBYs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not in my backyards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like all the people wanting to build affordable housing and cooperatives in a community, and then all these people coming together and getting the state to say no, absolutely not. It's like, well, okay, I thought this was a free market. I mean, I'm just trying to use the tools you're giving me, and now you're taking those tools away from me when it's convenient for me. So,
go ahead. I'm sorry, Suzanne.
Oh no, I'm sorry. No, it's true. They do, and that's the whole thing about property ownership and utilizing the state, like such as cops, to keep people under control and like like if it is something that we can use, and it has been done historically, not even like historical, like hundreds of years ago, but contemporary history. So it also kind of where ableism comes into that is that you're removing where you have to make enough money or be able to do a job to make enough money to live in your own house.
Yeah.
You're kind of like just distributing the heaviness and the stress. You're distributing that with other people, and you're removing the ableism in it, if that makes any sense. I wasn't very eloquent about that.
I hear you 100%. There's a term in the disability community called the access donut hole. And it's the economic, it's wild because it's so unique to the disabled community that how do I describe it really accessibly? It's the cost of living that specifically pertains to a disability that can like really never ever be profitable ever in an individual's life, essentially. Like for instance, I work with clients that are quadriplegic, so they can't even move without help. So they need a team of people just to get up, get dressed, go to work, do all the things that a person does at work, come home, finish their night out how they want, and go to bed, and then do that day in and day out, and then deviate from that as they can to get away from the 9-to-5 grind or whatever their job is, to go out and be social in the community, which comes with its own baggage. So the cost of that for the individual in that position, even if they're like full on, they got a house, they got gear, they got a life, they have access, the cost is overwhelming. Like wheelchair maintenance alone, it's wild. It's like owning a car. I'm not even lying, especially when you get through a lot of the insurance layers that are related to cost of medical stuff. And the amount of benefit that a person gets on disability from the state, and it varies from place to place. This is where the donut hole gets like brutal. Is that if you get a certain amount of benefits from the state for your disability to help you get to the point where you start making money, if you start making a certain amount of money, you lose all your benefits.
Yeah, that's God.
Which means that your ability to like run a business or whatever needs to have in its business plan, essentially, if I'm understanding this correctly, like when our company, when my business idea, this is assuming you're even starting a business and you're not doing a 9-to-5 grind. But let's just say you're starting a business. Let's just say, because people with disabilities often get described as like, oh, these poor, incapable people. But like there's plenty of disabled people that like do a whole lot with what they're working with. And so even someone who's functional enough where they have the liquidity and ability and access socially to start a business needs to understand that if they're getting benefits, as soon as they start making a certain amount of money, all the money they're getting to pay their caregivers is going to vanish. And they need to pay all their caregivers out of pocket now, which means that the amount of profit they're making is like substantially eaten up. Which means that what's left as profit of their own money, which is what you generate autonomy from in a capitalist system, is negated severely, right? And so that donut hole causes all kind of problems. And there's legislation going into effect that people are doing on grassroots level, trying to influence or they're changing certain aspects of that. But even from a legislative point of view, that donut hole exists everywhere disability exists, where just the simple the metabolic cost of doing a task can be insurmountably more than a person who has the ability to do it. And those costs, if you're an individualist who prioritizes the individual, you're damning someone with a disability who needs to generate labor to generate labor. in a way that's particularly unique to their physical, emotional, intellectual process, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Then that's exactly kind of like the track I was going on. So like, this system just keeps them in this, just extremely difficult situation, and they can't get out of it. And so that's why, this is why I feel like co-ops are the answer to really like undermining the housing situation. And then, a lot of times anarchists that end up in those sort of co-ops, they all, distribute the responsibilities. Mm-hmm. So dishes, cooking, cleaning, things like that. It's all distributed. And so in the ableism sense, it's really like taking that burden off of the disabled. So, and it's not saying, okay, if you don't have the ability to do this, you can't be here. It's not that at all. It's that everybody supports one another, right, in some function or another, So
there are some hacks, some practical hacks that we can do right now around this. Assuming someone was evil, even let's just say someone got a hold of a house in terms of ownership and wanted to actualize this, right? And to be clear, with the amount of resources we have, it wouldn't take many people organizing to just generate ownership of a house. It really wouldn't.
Yeah.
And the model I've heard in the disability community for this anarchist perspective, this is not my idea. This is someone else shared this idea with me in the community, and I was like, this is brilliant. And I've been kind of stuck on it for a while, which is it takes the idea of communal housing and takes it into this specific dimension of co-housing, where the model would be like, if you were to frame it as like a business plan for people that are stuck in the capitalistic framework, the business plan of this nonprofit organization would be that there's no rent generated at all. Like it's if there's any tax, it would be a tax exempt, like it would be a tax exempt NPO, and it would be permanent housing for one or more people with severe enough disabilities that they cannot function without a team of caregivers, right? And from an access and functional needs perspective, the disabled person would be an autonomous agent. They'd be like, this is my home, this is where I live for the long term. But I want to live with people and I need care. So providing housing for people that want to simultaneously provide access in the disabled community and have a home, right? So that creates a space for the able-bodied to feel safe and secure enough, and the negotiation of how that works in terms of time boundaries, that's a general conversation of caregiving and care provision in the disabled community, and it's a constant negotiation. But the idea of forming units where the stablest agent is the disabled person here, like this is their home for years, and they can't avoid the need to have people in their lives, and they're willing to live with other people, right? This model could be extended out to multiple houses, where you're like, we're going to buy two houses. This one house is for the caregivers and the other house is for the care recipient, right? And there's always two people there 24 hours a day. And there's housing here for the caregivers that are invested in that. And other caregivers can participate. They don't have to be particularly plugged into this, but creating the space for this is housing for care providers. And then from there, care providers will generate their own culture. They'll be like, this is what we need in order to commit to the sacrifice of our time and energy to this person's basic needs so that we can have a home, right?
Exactly.
It's meeting the needs of multiple people in a way that's mutually beneficial, that can meet the housing market head on without disrupting it so severely that and this is the biggest risk of disruption, is that the disabled are always going to suffer the most, period. I don't care if it's the most righteous armed revolution that anybody could conceive of, that in this timeline reaches maximum benefit for all life in the universe. If that such a thing exists, that transition, if it involves lots of disruption, by default, the disabled will suffer the most because they require the most tight web of care. And that web of care is more tied to the environment than someone who has the option to just get up and walk out of a room, right? And the thing about this conversation is that we are all going to end up there, right? At some point in your life, you're going to be that person who doesn't have the option to get up and walk out of the room. Time will ensure that. So when we're talking about providing access for the disabled across all stages of life, we're preparing ourselves for the environment that we want to die in, right?
Yeah.
So that's the feedback loop of this is in my self-interest to create this safe of an environment so that as I'm dying, I still have access to what makes me feel the most grateful to even have lived this life and to die in such a place of safety and love, right? And I don't think that's a terrible goal, and I don't think it's super unachievable. That's why I wanted to present that kind of practical hack. If you guys are thinking about putting any projects in order, that's one we could put on the tool shelf, I think, of this could work to build what we're talking about within this capitalist pressure that we're all dealing with, you know.
And another practical thing, I just wanted to say, even though we are anarchists, it doesn't mean, I've seen a lot of people that completely reject any sort of political, any sort of work in the political field, or what am I trying to say? Like getting involved politically, which I think is kind of bogus because everyone is political. Like everyone is political, whether or not they identify as it. But I just wanted to say, as far as practical goes, I was reading and listening to podcasts about Murray Bookchin, and one thing that he was, talking about, he did not reject political activism. And in fact, he even was okay with forming delegates, or not delegates, interest groups, grassroots interest groups in a community. So essentially, this is anarchist praxis, and then getting, using it in the current system by sending a delegate into the government to vote in their behalf. And the difference between a delegate and a representative is that a delegate is less permanent. They go in, they vote, and if they don't vote the way the community said to vote, then they get replaced easily. So I just wanted to say that this is something that I believe needs to be done, like more local organization, like more getting involved with local politics that can kind of at least prepare us for, get us into the situation where we feel we're ready for the next step. I didn't want to get I didn't want to steer it too much into the state, but this is something important to talk about, is housing inequality can be dealt with local governments, but rather than focusing on an elected representative, get into interest groups where you can, for instance, you could start a a group that's specifically for people with disabilities that have a hard time getting housing for affordable, and getting them to vote in a certain way that kind of nudges the politicians to say, look, we need more affordable housing for people who cannot afford it. But
that already exists. Just for the record, there's a lot.
Yeah, no, it does. I guess what I wanted to say is, like, I wanted to, let people know that it does exist because, I don't know. I've just come across a lot of anarchists who they just completely reject any participation in any government, whether small or large. And that to me is ableist because it's like, well, I have the means to escape the community, escape the issues in society. So goodbye, but rather than actually organizing at the local base, like we want to strive for a system that eliminates hierarchical power structures. But it doesn't mean we can't organize locally and influence local politics to make sure that everyone is taken care of. That is mutual aid.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that clear to people that, being an anarchist doesn't mean you can't get involved with your local governments. Make sure that everyone's needs are met before you take the next step forward. But I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I feel like I have a guest I could invite to speak that is like the perfect person to speak on this. And we could talk about that offline. I got to get going to work in about an hour. And we're going on 2 hours now, which I don't mind long form. I don't mind long form.
It didn't even feel like 2 hours at all.
No, right?
I was kind of thinking that maybe we should get used to like breaking up the episodes, saying like part 1 and 2, because I know that for me, when I see a podcast that's 2 hours long, I'm just like, that's an investment right there. I mean, it could be good, but that's a long thing to sit through in one chunk of time.
I feel that. I think I personally love both. I very much love both. I've done long form before. It's its own fun. And I've done short form and it's its own, that's also fun. Just trying to be like super succinct and boom, boom, boom. So yeah. Do you guys feel comfortable ending here? Is there anything you wanted to add or?
Oh, I absolutely feel comfortable. I think we covered, a perspective of green anarchism as it relates to ableism. And then also, to inject your perspectives about it and how our society plays a role. So I think we covered some good topics. It's, an expansive conversation as it is, so I don't think everything will be covered in one, podcast. But I think bringing it up will just hopefully get more people talking. And that's the goal.
Yeah. So anybody listening, if anybody hears this who wants to join in, fucking let's do it. We got to make a channel for those people, though. We got to build this shit.
Yeah. We got to launch our site so that they have a place to contact us.
Yeah. And that's actually something I wanted to, if we can, just by doing this, creating this nodal point of communication where we're allowing our affinity to build this conscious agency, this collective conscious agency, encouraging everybody to also be doing that. Right? Like we're in a, the whole idea of a delegate turns me the fuck off. I don't like it. I don't like delegates. I don't like representatives. I don't like liaisons. But I recognize that like messengers are going to be a thing. But if there's any myth that the pandemic in America has dispelled, it's that we have to travel a bunch to do a bunch of the shit that we do. And that's just not true. And that's super applicable to people with severe mobility disabilities. Because, I mean, I've been working with people that I've watched for years, and before COVID, they were having to travel such extreme distances, and it took so much work. And now when that's not allowed, like, it's just like, oh, we could have always been doing this. Like, and I gotta say, it must certainly not go back. Like, to go back to the amount of necessary traveling that we do is just a bad idea, especially when we can hone in on neutralizing waste and honing in on the efficiency of the technology that we need to stay in touch with each other, right? Like, that's where like technology and permaculture, I think that's where they can marry. Right? Like, I don't think you have to be a Luddite to be like, we can make these devices that allow us to stay interconnected. And I think the violence at the root of that is where are we extracting those resources and how to do so. Right? The technology isn't evil, so to speak. It's how we create it.
Exactly.
Right? And so, yeah, I guess let's end with that for me.
Beautifully said. All right, guys. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for hearing my perspective. It's greatly appreciated. It's a huge act of kindness, and I don't take it lightly.
Aww.
So, so thank you both so much for everything.
Thank you. All right, y'all.
All right.